the morning Tate Calloway walked out of the Winnipeg courthouse. He had $43 in his wallet, a duffel bag with 3 days of clothes, and a daughter who kept asking when they were going home. He didn't have an answer for that. The home she was asking about. The one with the yellow kitchen, and the tire swing in the backyard, and the dog named Biscuit who slept at the foot of her bed. That home now belonged to Renata. The judge had made that very clear at 9:47 that morning, clear and final, and without any particular expression on his face, as if he were reading a grocery list instead of handing a man's life to someone else. Tate had stood there in his one good blazer, the navy one Claire had picked out for him years ago, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet he no longer lived in. And he had not said a word. His lawyer, a tired man named Jerry who had done his best, touched his arm once on the way out. Tate nodded. There wasn't much else to do. Outside on the steps, November was doing what November in Manitoba always did, pressing down on everything with a gray, damp weight that made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath. Maisie was 6. She had her mother's eyes. Tate's first wife, Claire, who had died of an aortic dissection on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago while she was picking up milk, and she had his stubborn streak, which he both loved and feared in equal measure. She was standing beside him on the courthouse steps with her backpack on, and her mittens clipped to her sleeves because she always lost them otherwise, and she was looking up at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be scared. "Are we going to the apartment now?" she asked. "Yeah, bug. We're going to the apartment." The apartment was a 2-bedroom unit in a building on Corydon that smelled like other people's cooking and had a radiator that clanked every night at 2 in the morning. He had rented it 6 weeks ago, when Renata's lawyer first started making noises about the house. He'd bought a second-hand dresser for Maisie's room, put up the same constellation stickers she had on her ceiling at home, ordered her the same brand of lavender shampoo. He was trying. That was the only thing he knew how to do anymore. Just keep trying, even when the trying didn't feel like enough. Renata had made sure the judge knew about the business losses. 3 years of them, right there in the financial disclosure documents, printed out and highlighted in yellow. She had a good lawyer, better than Jerry, if Tate was being honest, and that lawyer had painted a very particular picture of Tate Calloway, a man who had once owned a successful precision manufacturing firm north of the city, who had taken on too much debt expanding during the pandemic, who had watched 2 major contracts evaporate inside of 18 months, and who had, in the end, been forced to restructure. What the documents didn't say, what Tate had never told anyone except Claire, and Claire was gone, was that the restructuring had included something else. A quiet sale, a private arrangement, something he had put together in the worst year of his life, when the grief and the balance sheets and the sleepless nights with a toddler had all collapsed on top of each other at once. And he had made a decision that most people would have called desperate. He didn't think of it as desperate. He thought of it as doing what Claire would have done. Claire had always said the only assets worth protecting were the ones that kept growing while you slept. He had listened to her. He just hadn't told anyone he'd listened. The woman who had made Tate's last 2 years considerably more complicated was named Renata Voss, and she had married him 11 months after Claire died. People thought that was fast. Tate knew it was fast. He had known it was a mistake approximately 4 months in, when he started to understand the difference between someone who made you feel less alone and someone who actually cared whether you were okay. Renata was very good at the first thing. She was not particularly interested in the second. She was 38, sharp-looking, worked in commercial real estate development in the Exchange District, and she had a way of entering a room like she was already evaluating its square footage. She had been kind to Maisie in the beginning, patient and even warm in a way that Tate had been so starved for that he'd mistaken it for love. It wasn't until the second year that he started to notice how Renata's kindness toward Maisie had a ceiling, and how quickly she reached it when Maisie was inconvenient or loud or simply needed too much. By the time Tate filed for divorce, Renata had already spoken to 3 lawyers. She got the house. She got the Jeep. She got the savings account that had $34,000 in it, which was, as far as anyone's documents could confirm, most of what Tate Calloway had left in the world. What she did not get, what nobody in that courtroom had thought to ask about, because nobody knew it existed, was the company. Not Calloway Precision. That one was gone, absorbed into a holding structure during the restructuring 2 years ago. The company Tate was thinking about now was smaller, technically, in terms of how it appeared on paper. It had been founded 18 months ago under a numbered corporation registered in Alberta. Its primary asset was a portfolio of aerospace component patents that Callaway Precision had developed between 2018 and 2021, patents that Tate had retained personally when the restructuring closed, because his restructuring lawyer, not Jerry, a different one, a very quiet and very good woman named Fern, had advised him that intellectual property held by an individual was treated differently than assets held by a corporation in dissolution. Fern had been correct. The patents had sat quietly for 18 months while the world, and Renata's lawyers, looked at the empty bank account and the shuttered factory in the Navy blazer and concluded that Tate Callaway was, for all practical purposes, finished. In September, a defense contractor based in Calgary had signed a licensing agreement for 3 of those patents. In October, a second agreement followed with a manufacturer in Ontario. The combined value of those 2 agreements over the 10-year licensing terms was somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 million. Tate had not mentioned this in the financial disclosure documents because Fern had advised him very carefully, very precisely, that the licensing income had not yet been received, the agreements had closed after the disclosure deadline, and the patents themselves had been appropriately excluded from the matrimonial asset pool under the terms of their original retention. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly as it should be. He had just never felt the need to bring it up. The apartment on Corydon was not so bad, once you got used to the radiator. Maisie decided she liked it, because the kitchen window looked out onto a bakery across the alley, and sometimes in the mornings you could smell the bread. She started calling it the bread window, and Tate started making a point of opening it, even in November, just long enough for her to get a few seconds of warm yeast smell before the cold drove them back inside. He dropped her at school every morning at 8:15 and picked her up at 3:30. He made dinner every night. Nothing impressive, pasta and chicken things, a beef stew he'd learned from Claire's mother, that Maisie had decided was her favorite food on earth. He read to her every night, the same series of books about a girl who befriended a lighthouse keeper. And when she fell asleep, he sat in the living room with his laptop and worked. There was a lot to do. The licensing agreements had opened other conversations. A firm in British Columbia had reached out about a 4th patent. His Alberta company, still technically unnamed, still operating out of a registered address and a post office box, needed a real structure now. A real office, real staff. Fern was helping him build it. They talked 3 or 4 times a week. His sister, Dara, called from Thunder Bay every Sunday. She was the only person who knew about any of it. "You should tell someone," she said one Sunday in late November. "Not for the money. Just, you're carrying a lot." "I'm fine, Tate. I'm handling it. I know you're handling it. I'm saying you don't have to handle it alone." He thought about that after he hung up. He thought about it while he washed the dinner dishes and listened to Maisie singing to herself in her room. One of those formless songs kids made up out of nowhere, full of words that almost rhymed and didn't need to. He thought about Claire. About how she had never once asked him to handle things alone. About how the last real conversation they'd had, the one the night before she died, standing in the kitchen while the kettle boiled, had been about nothing important, just the weekend and some renovation thing she'd seen online, and how he would give almost anything to have that conversation back. Not a meaningful one, not a goodbye, just the ordinary one. Just her voice in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. He missed her in ways that didn't have names yet. The call came on a Thursday, 2 weeks before Christmas. He was in the parking lot of Maisie's school, engine running, heat on, watching the first real snow of December come down in that slow, certain way that meant it was planning to stay. The number was from Calgary. He answered it. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the head of strategic acquisitions for a company he recognized immediately, a mid-sized aerospace firm that had been in the news lately for a series of high-profile partnerships with the Canadian Space Agency. She spoke carefully and professionally, and what she said was that her firm had been following the licensing agreements that had closed in the fall, and they were interested in discussing something larger. Not a license. An acquisition. Full portfolio, full rights. with a role for the founding patent holder if he was open to it. She gave him a number. He sat in the parking lot for a moment after she finished. Through the windshield, the snow kept falling, very peaceful, indifferent to everything. "Can I have a few days?" he said. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." He hung up just as the school doors opened and Maisie came out in her red coat, backpack bouncing, scanning the parking lot for his car. When she found it, she waved, both arms, like she always did, like she'd been gone for a year instead of 6 hours. He waved back. The number the woman from Calgary had given him was $62 million. He called Fern from his apartment that night after Maisie was asleep. She already knew. They had been in conversations with the Calgary firm at the Periphery, carefully for the last 3 weeks, and she had not wanted to raise it until there was something concrete. "This is concrete," Tate said. "Yes," Fern said. "It is. What do? We take our time. We get independent valuations. We make sure the structure protects you and Maisie going forward. And then, if the terms are right, we close it." He was quiet for a moment. "Fern, is this actually real?" She was quiet too, in the measured way she had, and then she said, "Tate, you built something real. You protected it when everything else was falling apart. This is what that looks like from the other side." He sat with that for a long time after they hung up. Renata found out the way things like that usually came out, through the Periphery. A comment at an industry event, a name that came up twice in the wrong context. She had people in commercial real estate, and commercial real estate talked to everyone, and sometime in early January, someone mentioned to someone else that a numbered Alberta company with a connection to the old Callaway patents had been in acquisition talks with a major aerospace firm. She called her lawyer the next morning. Her lawyer called Jerry. Jerry called Tate, sounding more awake than he usually did. "She's claiming the patents should have been disclosed," Jerry said. "She's saying they were developed during the company, during the marriage. The patents were retained personally before our marriage," Tate said. "Fern has the documentation. All of it. Dates, filings, retention agreements, everything." There was a pause. "Tate," Jerry said slowly, "how long have you known about this?" "A while." Another pause, longer. "Okay," Jerry said. "Okay, send me what Fern has." The filing came 3 weeks later. Renata's lawyer was arguing that the patents constituted undisclosed matrimonial assets, that the retention structure had been deliberately designed to exclude them from the settlement, and that the divorce agreement should be reopened on grounds of material non-disclosure. Fern read the filing, and then called Tate and said, very calmly, that this was exactly what they had prepared for, that the documentation was airtight, and that she looked forward to explaining it to a judge. The hearing was in February, on a Wednesday morning when the temperature in Winnipeg was -27, and the city had that brittle crystalline quality it got in deep winter, everything hard-edged and very quiet. Tate wore the navy blazer again. He didn't know why. Maybe because he'd worn it the first time and survived. Renata was already seated when he came in. She looked the same, pulled together, composed, that particular expression she wore in rooms where she expected to win. Her lawyer was beside her, a stack of folders on the table, organized with colored tabs. Tate sat down across the room. Fern was beside him, small and unhurried, a single portfolio in front of her. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and the air of someone who had heard every variation of this argument and found most of them tedious. She reviewed the filing. She asked questions. Fern answered them in that clear, quiet way she had. No drama, no performance, just the facts in the order they had occurred. The patents had been developed between 2018 and 2021. They had been personally retained by Tate Callaway at Restructuring Close, which occurred in March 2022. Tate and Renata had married in October 2022. The patents were therefore not matrimonial assets under any reasonable reading of applicable Manitoba family law. The retention had not been designed to exclude them from the settlement because they had never entered the settlement's scope to begin with. The financial disclosure documents had accurately reflected the assets in play. All of this was documented. All of it was filed. The dates didn't lie. Renata's lawyer pushed on the timing, argued that the restructuring and the marriage were too close together, that the retention had been strategic. Fern agreed that it had been strategic. She was not sure what the problem with that was. The judge made no ruling from the bench. She said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 30 days. Outside the courthouse, it was still -27. Fern shook Tate's hand and told him she felt good about it. He thanked her. He meant it. He sat in his car for a few minutes before driving away, heat blasting, watching other people walk past on the sidewalk with their shoulders up around their ears and their breath coming out in white clouds. A city doing what it always did, getting through the winter, not because it was easy but because that was simply what you did. He drove to Maisie's school. It was pickup time. The written decision came on a Thursday in early March, when the snow was finally starting to loosen its grip, and there were mud tracks in the school parking lot, for the first time since October. The judge found in Tate's favor on all points. The patents were pre-matrimonial personal assets, properly retained, properly documented, not subject to the terms of the divorce settlement. The application to reopen the agreement was dismissed. Renata's claim had no legal foundation. Jerry called to tell him, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it, a kind of recalibration. Like a man updating a long-held assumption about what was possible. Fern texted 3 words, clean, as documented. Tate sat in his apartment kitchen, the one with the bread window, and read the decision twice. Not because he needed to understand it, just because he wanted to let it be real. The acquisition closed in April. It was not $62 million in the end. By the time the independent valuations were done and the final terms were negotiated, it was $67 million, with an additional $8 million contingent on performance milestones over the next 5 years. Fern had pushed on the contingencies. The Calgary firm had agreed to most of what she'd asked. Tate kept his role with the new entity, head of original development, part-time, with appropriate compensation and the freedom to work from anywhere. He didn't need the salary. He wanted the work. He had liked the work, even when it wasn't worth anything on paper, even when he was doing it alone, at a kitchen table at midnight, while his daughter slept in the next room. He told Maisie about some of it, in the way you explained things to a 6-year-old. That the work he'd been doing had turned out to be worth a lot, and that they weren't going to have to worry about the apartment anymore, and that she could pick wherever she wanted for a birthday trip this year. She thought about this for a very long time. "Can we go somewhere with a real lighthouse?" she asked. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "We can go somewhere with a real lighthouse." He told Dara on a Sunday call the first week of May. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "Claire knew. It wasn't a question. We talked about it," Tate said, "before she died. Not the specific thing, not the patents. But she always said the assets that matter are the ones growing while you sleep. I just didn't forget it." Dara's voice when she spoke again was careful in that way it got when she was trying not to cry. "She'd be really proud of you. I don't know about that." "I do," Dara said. "She would." He stood at the bread window after he hung up. The bakery across the alley was doing something new. A line out the door on Saturday mornings now. People from all over the neighborhood, a little chalkboard out front with rotating specials. Maisie had started tracking the chalkboard. She reported on it most mornings like a weather update. Today it said, brown butter cardamom buns. Made this morning. Tate put on his jacket. "Hey Bug," he called toward the hallway. "You want to go get something from the bakery?" Maisie appeared in the doorway in approximately 4 seconds, already putting on her shoes. "They have the cardamom ones today," she said, like he hadn't already seen it. "I know," he said. "Those are the best ones. I know that too." She finished tying her shoe and stood up and looked at him, really looked at him, the way kids sometimes did, where you could tell they were checking something, some internal reading they were too young to name, and whatever she saw must have been okay, because she grabbed his hand without saying anything and pulled him toward the door. Outside, the Winnipeg spring was doing its tentative best. The elms along Corridon were showing their first thin, green. The sidewalk still had that wet gravel smell that came every year at the end of winter, that smell that always made Tate think of possibility, of things starting again, of ground that had been frozen finally letting go. He held Maisie's hand and they walked toward the bakery, and the morning was ordinary and quiet in his. And he decided that was more than enough.